See, we could go ahead and start. It's slowing down a little bit, but I think we can admit people and. Okay.
So we could invite everyone to mute who isn't speaking. If everyone, I see some names on here who are unmuted, and might help if everybody mutes. And if our hosts can mute those who aren't able to mute themselves. And then we will pick our interpretation, English or Spanish, and then Donna will begin.
So I'll ask those who are going to read the prayer to unmute, and I'll share my screen. Let us remember that we're in the presence of our holy and loving God. Colleen.
O Great Spirit, help us to speak the truth quietly, to listen with an open mind when others speak, and to find the peace that may be found in silence.
Mother Earth, hear your children as we sit here on your lap and listen to the echoes of your voice in our brother, the wind, blowing from all directions. The soft and gentle raindrops that fall are the tears you cry for your children.
To nurture us, to teach us to nurture our children who cry out to you in love and pain, O wise mother. May the winds echo the knowledge of the ancient ones who await the future with us, unseen, yet visible when we turn our eyes to the world of spirit.
Let us hear their voices in the winds. Grant us the trusting innocence of a small one, the fire and independence of adolescence, the acceptance of responsibility that comes with commitment and maturity of heart.
Grant us youthful followers, strong and true, to carry the story of the elders, who by their long lives have learned and stored wisdom and knowledge. Help them to walk in balance and harmony with you, and bring us all closer to our Creator, until we return to rejoin the council of the elders in the presence of the one who created all.
Amen.
Amen.
Well, I'd like now to introduce our guest speaker, who is, some of you know very well, some of you she may be a new person for. So we're delighted to have Ann Garrido with us. Ann is the oldest of 8 children in a close-knit Catholic family from St. Louis, Missouri. She taught middle school for 4 years on the island of Guam, and then through some mysterious mail was led to attend Aquinas Institute of Theology. Oh, Listra, can you mute, please? Thanks. Okay, so she taught middle school on the island of Guam for 4 years. And then she went from there to attend Aquinas Institute of Theology. She got her Master of Divinity and also a doctorate in of ministry and preaching. And she actually joined Aquinas Institute's faculty in 2000. So she's got a long history with Dominican life. Over the past 2 decades, she's taught a range of courses in pastoral theology, homiletics, catechetics, while also serving in a variety of administrative positions, director of field education, director of distance learning of the Aquinas Ministry Integration Project, director of the D.Min program, and also director of the Masters in Catechesis of the Good Shepherd. And as some of you may know, she also regularly contributes to the Dominican preaching site, wordop.org. She's the author of several books, including Redeeming Administration, Redeeming Conflict, and Let's Talk About Truth. She's currently on a writing sabbatical right now. We just learned doing Redeeming Power, which is very exciting. She travels nationally and internationally, and she helps communities talk about the topics they find the toughest to talk about. So conversations that always involve questions of truth. So Ann, we are so delighted to have you with us and we welcome you.
All right. Oh, thank you for the warm welcome. And thank you for the invitation to be with all of you this afternoon. I am absolutely thrilled. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll pull up my screen as well. And I want to start this afternoon with a story of my time at Aquinas way back 1,000 moons ago when I was a student. So many of you probably also have in fine memory, one of our professors, Sister Ginger Peters from Houston Dominicans. She was my professor for history of Christian spirituality. And if you knew Ginger, you knew she was all about student projects. And so she would love to have students work on things of deep interest in themselves and then spend a little bit of time sharing their research with the class. And the class I should say that I was in, History of Christian Spirituality, was probably mostly religious women and men. And one of the women in our group was the vocation director for the diocese in which she ministered. And when she got up to do her presentation, she actually started that day with a really quirky question that she made the group talk about in small groups. And before I actually share with you more about the research or why she asked us this question or the hypothesis that was behind it, I thought it might actually be interesting today as a quirky icebreaker for the time we have with each other to ask you the same question that she asked us in that class 20 years ago, because it's a question that's hung with me ever since. So I'm going to go ahead and put up on the screen the weird question that's going to be our first breakout question for the day. So, whoops, sorry. There we go. When we go into breakouts, we'll be in there for about 7 minutes. And I invite you, if you don't know the other people in breakout, say hello and greet each other. And then here's the question. When your community gathers for assembly or chapter, now I'm not talking like in your house, but like when your whole congregation gathers together, what do you argue about the most? Or what gets people the most agitated when your whole congregation is together? That makes sense? So we'll get a way of saying hello to each other in the group. We'll be out there for about 5 minutes or so. We'll actually give you 7, and then we'll bring you back into the room, okay? If you could ask one person in your group before we leave to be the headline person for your group. I should say that what happens in Futuring Dominican Leadership stays in Futuring Dominican Leadership. So nothing you talk about there are we going to share outside of our Zoom space today. And you don't need to record names and dates and places, but just like if you were recording the headlines that come up in your group, when you come back, I'm going to invite somebody from each group to put those in chat for us so that we can just get a snapshot of what's going on in response to this question. Okay, I'm going to hit stop share. And let's go ahead and break out into groups. I imagine as every other group's watching what had popped up with some of the other groups that you're like, oh yeah, that resonates. Huh? We've had those conversations too. Yeah. So a lot of the things that are popping up are things that are directly related to what we're talking about today in terms of the generational issues within our congregations about caring for the sisters and toward the end of life, and then also the beginning of our new members coming into our congregations. Yeah. Okay. These are fantastic. Let me tell you the reason why I asked you this question, and then we can look at this again in light of that. So when the vocation director asked this question to our class in History of Christian Spirituality, we asked like, well, why are you asking this question of us? And she said, well, my first task as the vocation director is helping to match people who are contacting the diocese saying, I'm interested in religious life, to help match them with what would be the congregation that would be the right fit for their charism. And she said, but before I could do that, I had to ask religious communities, tell us who you are. Tell us about your charism. And she said, what was interesting in working with religious communities for her was a lot of times, both religious and women's community, or both men's and women's religious communities had a really hard time articulating who they were about. Like, we all are taking vows of poverty, chastity, obedience. Many of us are saying we work with the poor. And she goes, it was hard to be able to distinguish one community from another community from another community. And she said what she discovered was that the most effective way of helping a congregation to begin to articulate its charism was to ask, what is it that you argue about the most? She said, because when you argue about something, you only argue about things that you care about. And that what you find out is what you argue about the most is oftentimes what you care about the most. And in some ways, what we argue about is revelatory then of that golden thread that bonds us in community with each other in the first place, which is our charism. So she said she would go to Franciscan communities that were getting together for their equivalent of like a chapter and saying, what do you fight about the most? And when she would look at this, she would say, it's some way, shape, or form, way down deep. Oftentimes what they were fighting about was poverty and simplicity of life. Like some were saying like, oh, we're not living simply enough. Our money should be going here. And others are saying, oh no, like we need to be able to take care of our members of our community. Because they were always arguing about poverty. She said when she went to Benedictine communities and she asked them the question, sorry, what do you argue about? Obviously, I get really passionate about conflict. So she said that when she went to the Benedictine communities and asked them this question, the Benedictines, at some way, shape, or form, were always arguing about work and prayer. Like, what's the right balance of work and prayer? Ora et labora. Or as I'm on sabbatical this semester at St. John's up in Collegeville, they've taught me it's ora et labora et labora et labora. Like we can't figure out like what's the right balance between work and prayer. What I was curious about was I have some suspicions around what Dominicans what is the core of what Dominicans are all about. And it was interesting just to find out, like, if we were to go underneath these, what would it tell us about, as Dominicans, what are we most passionate about? And the reason why I also wanted to try this out as an experiment with us as we started today was because sometimes I know that it's frustrating. And Lorraine and I were just talking in preparation for the day. She goes, we are so tired of the word diminishment, right? We're so tired of talking about things that are going wrong or feel like they're going wrong rather than things that are going right. And we don't have a great desire to air out this like dirty laundry. We want to put that out, what we're upset about. But it's possible also that what we could begin to think about is how do we do a reframe around these things that are causing so much tension in the wider Dominican life right now. Maybe we could begin to think about them as revelatory to us about what it is that we most deeply care about. Because that might actually help us begin to get to the question that we're going to be asking today around the question of our deepest values as women Dominicans. So that it really is where we are right now is because this is where our passion, it's our passion that has taken us here. And it's our passion, it's our charism that's actually helped us to even want to be able to have this kind of conversation with each other in the first place. So my understanding is that you as a group, as a whole, are still at the very beginning of an immensely daring and exciting project of envisioning Dominican life out into the future. And as torchbearers for your congregations of that future, you are presently at the stage of trying to arrive at what is it across the 19 different congregations that our members are representing here, that what are the deepest gifts, the deepest values that animated our congregational pasts and our congregational presence, and that we want to continue to put at the service of the future if there's still a need for this unto the future. I think the good news of what I want to say today is that there is a great need for what you have to offer out into the future. That I know that when I say that, I don't think that this is necessarily true of all religious congregations. A couple of years ago, this is probably a couple decades ago, I should actually date myself here. I've had the chance to work with a lot of different women's religious communities over the course of time. And that's been one of the greatest gifts in my life. And there was a community that I met probably 2 or 3 decades ago who they're a group of Irish sisters who their particular charism that they had been founded was to be housekeepers for missionary priests. And it was really interesting hearing them talk about like, well, what could our future be? I recently, in getting ready for today, did an extensive Google search to see whether like where they were today, like how had they prepared themselves for this present moment in time. And I couldn't actually find any trace of them any longer on the web, which was interesting unto itself. I am confident that that is not going to be the case with Dominican life. Not because I'm a fortune teller or anything, but because I am as confident about that as I am about anything that I am in life today, because I think that what is core to Dominican life is going to be even more needed in the coming century than it has been in the last century. But before I say a little bit about why I think that and why I'm so convicted about that, first, I think it's important to figure out what is core to Dominican life across the multiple different congregations that you all represent. And I had some, like I said, I had some idea about what might appear in chat as the hot topics right now. I also had some intuitions going into this conversation about what I think based out of my experience of working with many of you over the last 25 years through connections at Aquinas or the Word or so forth. I'm so grateful to have been so warmly welcomed into many, many different Dominican communities, and feel like I'm part of that larger Dominican family. But I also realize that because of the space in which I locate within the larger Dominican family, my own perspective might be quite skewed on this. So, for example, I might be more fixated on some aspects of the Dominican charism than others. And I don't want to project my own ideas of that onto all of you. So in preparation for today, I just wanted to confirm for myself that what I have in mind about Dominican life aligns with what you say about Dominican life. And there might be better ways of going about this. So one way of trying to figure that out is that opening exercise that we did. What do we argue about? But what I decided to do as a backup to that was I'm going to go on all of your websites and I'm going to look for all the congregations in the DLC and compiled whatever had been posted online in terms of your mission and your vision statement, or the who we are statements that appeared on your websites. And what I did then was I removed all of the extraneous words from the sentences. So all the ands and the thes and the ors, and even the we's and the believes. And what I did was I tried to save all of the nouns and the verbs and the key phrases. And this is a snapshot of what that looked like. So this goes on for 12 pages, but you can get a sense of what it looked like when all of these documents or all of these statements were compiled together. Now, was some of this subjective? in terms of what words I took out of the statements and which ones I kept. Yes, I will admit that. Could you base scientific research off of this? No, I would not try that. Nevertheless, I want to say that I think that doing this exercise illumined a few things that I found helpful or that I found interesting. And I wanted to share these a bit with you to provoke another way of getting into the question about values and charism. So I took the words that were compiled, again, this is about 12 pages, and I turned them into a word cloud. Now, I should say that the very first time that I tried doing this as a word cloud, I rapidly discovered that I was going to need to tidy it up a bit, in part because it took apart all of the phrases, and then it did things like it treated as separate words, things like preach and preaching and preaches. Those were coming out as 3 separate things instead of one. So the next time around, I tried to manipulate this a little bit more. And I will let you know that all of the slides that I'm sharing today, I am very happy to send out to you afterwards so that you can have a little bit more time to think about them and look at them a little bit more closely. This is what, trying to play with the theme of the Dominican DNA, I thought, let's try a helix. And then I realized that is not working at all. We're going to get microscopic little words there that nobody can read. So we're going to have to let go of the helix signal. But this is what it looked like after the words had been tidied up a little bit. I realize that even in this form, it can be quite difficult to process. So I'll give just a moment for you to get out your magnifying lenses. But again, I'll share this with you later. And again, I'll say this is not scientific. Mission vision statements are just one tool for getting at the question of Dominican charism. And I'm not entirely sure how word cloud technology does this and how accurate it is in actual proportionality wise. But there were some things when I was doing this exercise that struck me as I was going through the original word list. And then if only about the kinds of language that DLC congregations are drawn toward. So I want to offer a couple of additional word clouds that break down this 12-page list, maybe into some categories. And again, the categories that I've chosen might also be a little bit artificial. I don't know how deeply we can take these, but I thought they might be provocative or stir some thoughts within us. So the first thing that I wanted to look at was I went through and pulled out all of the verbs. And I was curious to know what kinds of verbs appeared in the Dominican mission and vision statements, who we are statements. Now, some of the verbiage that appeared, this might simply be based on the kinds of language that would be found in mission and vision statements, inherently. But I do want to observe there were a lot of really strong verbs in your mission and vision statements around committing and proclaiming. Like those were 2 things that came out really strong to me. In terms of the activities that you describe yourselves as doing, preaching, studying, ministering, no surprises there at all. One of the things which I thought was interesting myself was how many times the word live appears across mission statements. Now it's used in a lot of different ways. At a most basic way, there was a theme that it's not just what we do that's important, but who we are that's important. And this comes across in a number of different ways that will show up, and this will pop up in future slides too. That you want to make sure that you're practicing what you're preaching, so that you're living what you're preaching. You value living together. You live alongside other people in the world as sisters. You live in the sense that you are attentive to life. I guess like these are all just, I was just surprised, I guess, for myself, how often that word appeared. And it struck me as more important than maybe what I had thought about before. Another subcategory of verbs that appeared a lot in mission, vision, who we are statements were the verbs that end in ed, which tend to describe more the base out of which you act. So you do what you do because you've been, a keyword, called, or that you are rooted or grounded. Something that came across to me across these statements was the nature language of them, or the earth language of them, which I'll come back to again. Rooted, grounded, in a scripture, in a heritage. And then another one which popped up a lot, which I thought was a very strong word, was impelled. There's something that really thrusts you out into the world. There's a lot of strength and a lot of conviction in these words that, and then this brings me to the next slide, which has to do with the cluster of words. Observation number 2. Where do you find yourself impelled to go preach, serve, study, minister? So then I looked a little bit at the language that appeared in mission statements around the church and the world. So I was intrigued by looking at, I think all of us would agree that Dominican life is lived in medio ecclesia, right? In the middle of the church. And I'm sure that you acknowledge that too. Within DLC congregations, mission and vision statements, though, the language relates far more to the needs of the world than the needs of the church. So a sense of like, where are we called to serve? There's a very strong outward focus rather than an internally focused one. And one of the words that I was surprised appeared a whole lot that just hadn't struck me before was the frequency of the word all. So all people versus, say, just group, that you would want to ask the whole group out of the conversation that you had, that you were like, ooh, we would love to hear what the rest of the group has to say about this. I don't know if any group had something that they wanted to bring back to the group as a whole. Anna, would you want to unmute yourself?
Thank you. So we were actually surprised that a lot of what we are doing in our relationship with God and what we value did not come up. We were shocked that truth was not used with more frequency, as in, for example, justice. So I think one thing that came up to us is, what are we doing? Right? We are living this life, one where, we are in relationship with God, one where we follow the example of Jesus of Christ, right? One where we are women of truth. So are we not showcasing that on our websites? Are we doing the work, but are we not telling that story? Because what we were surprised is this is not coming up. So you mentioned that you took these words from our websites, correct?
And I should say, Anna, these are this is not scientifically well done, right? Like somebody could do this with greater care and so forth. And I don't think it's necessarily the only way that one could measure a group's value statements, right? It was one way of trying to get at what the values were. And maybe it's not saying that you aren't deeply committed to truth, because I believe you are. It might be that, we haven't articulated that as clearly as part of our charism, or it might be that that mission statements are one way in which we articulate it, or maybe it's that we want to rewrite our mission statements. So I don't think that it says that Dominicans are not committed to truth. But it was interesting to me too. Yeah.
Thank you.
You would like it, Anna, you would like it to be even more visual.
I'm just reporting for the group.
Okay.
Thank you, Anne.
Maybe another question. Oh yeah, Megan?
It's not a question, but just about our conversation in regards to some of your points. First, when you talked about where we express our spirituality or our Dominican life, it is in media ecclesia, in the midst of the church. But you said that ours was worldly focused, and which is different from an eternal life. And you used the phrase salvation of souls, which is a very Dominican phrase. And I just shared with the group that our brothers use that phrase all the time. That is the focus of their ministry, their mission. And it's not something that we focus on, but to get to the heart, that it's about bringing people closer to God in the end. So however we express that, whether it's coming back to church or whether it's we're going to the church, to the people who are on the margins who feel left out of the church, we're still working at bringing people closer together, whatever the language is that we use.
Yeah.
But we also have Fatima in our group, and she said, actually, for the millennials, that is a phrase that attracts us. It did for her, or does for her. So
Salvation of souls.
Salvation of souls. So
Yeah.
just having some conversation about why that is, when it's not something for those of us on the older end of this cohort.
Yeah.
And then in terms, I too, when you brought up about Eucharist and Liturgy of the Hours, when I was looking at that wordle, I was stunned when I saw Eucharist so small. And it doesn't surprise me because we, across the board, we love the Eucharist and we struggle with it. And it's about living the Eucharist. So it's the small e. I think that if we used the small e a lot in our mission statements, then that word would have popped out, I think, a lot more, because it is about living the Eucharist and not just going to mass kind of thing. So those were a couple of the topics that we talked about in our group.
Yeah. That's great. I kind of, Megan, what you were saying is when I was doing this exercise for myself, I did get intrigued. It would be really interesting to put the men's and the women's Dominican communities with each other. And I was curious to see what kinds of words would pop out there. That would be an interesting future thing to do for Dominican family, I think, as a whole. And also, I think no mission statement or vision statement is going to be able to have every word of the dictionary in it. So it's not that Dominicans here don't value salvation or Eucharist. It's just like, what language is the language of your heart, I guess, that most frequently emerges. And again, as committees that are writing mission statements, that's a hard work to do. There's a lot of wordsmithing that goes into that. And it might not actually be representative of how we talk on a daily basis as well. Yeah. But maybe one lens in. Okay. Yeah, Donna?
So one thing that we are really coming to understand more completely is that in this cohort, we are much more international than we were aware of before. And even here, we have people who are attending from other countries who are our sisters. And when we think about the words, this is what we talked about, that some words are more beautiful and more meaningful in different languages. And so wondering if, for example, our Mexican sisters were writing the mission statement, would they really choose different words because of the power of those words in their culture? And how do we honor that as we look at our internationality? How do we shift our focus from the North American view of things to the global view of things and find words that are meaningful across all cultures?
Yeah, that's a great insight. And Donna, even as I hear you speaking, I hear underneath what you're saying, both the care for the all, right, which I emphasized earlier, the care for language that we were talking about, like you care a lot about the words and you care about beauty. That was something that we didn't talk about, but I think that also is a core Dominican value of beauty. Other communities, I don't know, would care about that as much as you do. So it's a sign of what it is that you value. Oh, great insights. I want to spend a little bit more time also at the end of our time together, maybe having some time for general questions and responses too. Let me go ahead and talk a little bit about moving forward. Like where do I see these values that are popping up through the different ways that we're trying to approach surfacing of values? Where do I see some of the stuff that's come up being incredibly important as you look forward onto the future? So whether this constellation of Dominican values has any particular relevance for the years ahead. So I'm going to name 3 current dimensions of our Donna's focus global existence that I think the Dominican way of being in the world has something particular to contribute toward. There are clearly more than 3 ways. Let me be clear about that. Other people are going to see other ways. These are just 3 things that are first and foremost in my own mind as when I'm looking at the world from the location in which I am. The first thing, which I think the world desperately needs right now, that your charism has something to contribute to, is this worldly focus. So I believe that all of us who are here today believe that our lives are in the hands of a very good and loving God who will loves us in this life and will continue to love us beyond this life. And that the experience that we've had of the goodness of God in prayer inclines us not to, like, part of the reason why we're free to be this worldly is because it's not a major fear for us about the afterlife or what comes after this. I think for many Dominican women who I've encountered, we're sort of like with our Jewish sisters and brothers, a sense that we're not quite sure what eternal life looks like, but we trust that God is good and God's going to take care of that, and that what we really need to focus on is the here and the now in this world, doing the best we can by this world. And the recognition that echoed to me across the mission statements, and which when I'm reading the newspaper each day, strikes me, is that our world right now really is in a state of crisis that has not seen since the asteroid landed in the Gulf of Mexico and the dinosaurs ceased to be. That the world as a place that is hospitable, not only to human life, but to every form of created life is coming to an end. And that whereas our larger society seems to either bury its head in relationship to climate change or falls in a deep and paralyzing despair that can't help, the Dominican way of being in the world allows for, one, this contemplative stance that doesn't allow one to turn one's eyes away from the reality of the world at this moment in time. That you bring into this conversation this wide and broad perspective of the whole. You care about all people, you care about all of creation. There's not a narrow focus that the Dominican charism brings forward, like keeping house for a particular group of missionary priests, or even a focus of like ministry exclusively inside of the church. A third thing that you're bringing there to this global vision is a commitment to study that respects the sciences and that values increasing one's knowledge around what's going on in the world. And finally, what we keep talking about, this gift of words, knowing how to use the power of language, the beauty of language to be persuasive, to speak about meaningful and substantive things. Many scientists have noted, like they'll say, we know the data about climate change. What we don't know is how to communicate it effectively. And that is something you care about, words, and that matters right now. The gift of words that you have is something that the world's going to need. I would emphasize in looking at this particular crisis that our world faces, that the Dominicans were founded at a particular moment of crisis in the church. And that Dominicans have seen plagues, they have seen inquisitions, they have seen colonization, the decimation of indigenous peoples, the 30 Years' War, the two world wars. They have participated in many of these things. Sometimes Dominicans, as you guys know your history, have been part of the problem, but always also part of the solution. I can't think of any, if you were to read world history, I can't think of any major events in world history that somehow the Dominicans were not involved in. And that Dominicans have never been an order that sends thoughts and prayers. Dominicans have always been a hands-on kind of order, like an in the world kind of order. And the longevity of the Dominican order in history and the wisdom that has been gleaned from the experience of all the previous crises and is much, much needed in relationship to this key one that we are now facing globally. And you are already aware of this, as is indicated in those mission statements. And you are not, I see no indication of Dominicans backing away from this. A second thing why I think the Dominican charism is relevant for this moment in time and history is your charism for truth. So as the global climate crisis has begun to manifest itself, not just in stronger storms and flooded shorelines and droughts and the disappearance of species, but now also in food shortages, in massive immigrations, in new wars, in political turmoil. Like all of these things, if you look at them and you begin to study, you recognize like these can all be traced back to this global climate crisis that we are faced in. But underneath all of these varying issues, our inability to get real traction on them is connected to questions of truth. We are never going to be able to harness our energies and to pull in any united direction. If we're not going to be able to make sound decisions for the future until we as a world have high quality, honest information. And that everything in our wider communication system right now is working against that. So the decline of real newspapers, the proliferation of social media and cable news that has led people to receiving very personalized information that puts people into echo chambers. And more than that, leads us to receive more and more disinformation or misinformation. And this has led to very widespread beliefs that one, reality is unknowable, and that two, it doesn't really matter anyway. And for Dominicans, for the past 800 years, I mean, if there's anything these for Dominicans are the two worst heresies that there are. The idea that reality is unknowable and and that knowing reality doesn't matter, that it doesn't really make a difference. So we know that we don't know everything, that there's always going to be more to learn. And this is why we study. And this is why we contemplate so much. Our minds are small before the magnitude of what is real. So one of my favorite lines from Dominican life that a colleague at Aquinas said to me one time, we know that reality is a bazillion volts of electricity. And most of us have about 60-watt bulbs in our brain, right? Like our brains are so tiny in comparison to the magnificence of all that could be known about reality. And that, like I said, that's why we have to keep studying and keep contemplating. But we also don't think that God created the world to play a trick on us. You know, it's not like for us that we would say like, oh, that dinosaur bone that you found in the dirt, but oh, really, that must just be stuck there so that you would fall prey to sinister evolutionists. Like, no, we actually believe that there is such a thing as what's real and that it's important for us to know what is real. And that witness that Dominicans bring into the world, that truth exists and that it matters, that message is needed now in this particular time in history more than ever before. And I mean that. I know that it's a very, very common thing to say in talks, like more than ever before, but no, seriously. Before, we've had places in the world that suffered profound crises of truth. You think of classic examples of like Russia under Stalin or Germany under Hitler. But what we are witnessing right now is a global crisis of being able to tell what is real. And the Dominican witness to the importance of action that is grounded first in study and contemplation of reality in order to discern the best of our human capacities, what is true. That is a witness that the world as a whole is starving for right now, and that the world cannot function without. And if the Dominican life in any way was, that's why the world can't live without Dominicans. Like, this is the brightest light that I see the Dominicans have to share. And the whole world is re-articulating for the modern age the importance of truth and why it matters. And let me add then one third thing, is the witness that the Dominican charism that you offer to contemplation. I've already alluded to this in the previous points, but I want to draw this point out just a little bit more. Coupled with this omnipresent, never quite sure real news feed that populates the days of most people, and is that it's leading to an overwhelming sense of despair and helplessness, frazzle and frenzy. If COVID at least slowed us down for a couple of months, I think that most of us would now say that is gone. We are busier than we ever were before, and challenged to reply to this crisis, and to send money for this particular cause, and to show up for this event, and to join in this particular protest. Like, everybody has a sense that there is an escalation of tension that is going on. And especially for those of us who have a bent toward activism, rather than the ostrich mode, like putting our head in the sand. If you've got a bent toward, like, no, let's look at this, and let's look at this head on and do something about it. Anger and bitterness is also escalating in these circumstances, because there's people who were trying to do so much and we see so little change. I think many of you know that I spend a good deal of time right now working in the conflict management community. So we stopped calling it a long time ago, stopped calling it conflict resolution. It just makes for unreasonable expectations. But frankly, in the last couple of years, I've seen those that I work with in this community fall into quite a state of discouragement. And on days I would actually say despair. And I don't use that term lightly. When others in the consulting group that I work with that have named what I particularly bring to the team dynamic, they never say like, oh, it's that I was the smartest one in the group, or that I worked the hardest, or that I brought great new creative ideas, or that I was the most dedicated of the group. No, but what they'll say, the one thing they say that you bring to the group, Anne, is that you don't seem to be in a state of despair. And I know that that might seem like that's a really low bar, but in their view, it is not. And I attribute that to the witness of Dominicans in my life. That the Dominican way of being in the world is committed to acts of justice, but grounded in contemplation. That we do believe in speaking out and speaking up about the reign of God, but always out of a life of prayer. And I think that commitment to contemplation over time has taught us that the world is in bigger hands than our own. And we don't know how this is all going to work out, but we have this very deep sense that it is going to work out in some way, and that it's not all my responsibility. That I can do what I can do in an intentional and a purposeful way, but without stridency and without angst, because I can't do it all, and I don't need to do it all. I'm part of a community that's larger than myself. And each day, like John the 23rd was known to say, at each night, he could say, okay, God, I'm going to bed now. Like, this is in your hands. And wake up the next morning on that same note. That this Dominican gift that we have received capacitates us to make us some of the rarest birds on the face of the earth, which is activists who are not frazzled. And this is a very significant thing that Dominicans have to bring into the world at the present moment. Now, I know that again, there are like 400 other things that could be said here, right? Like there are 400 other ways to answer that question about why is the Dominican charism relevant for this particular time and place that we find ourselves in history and the future that we can see before us. And I think if you asked a different person, you could get 400 other really, really good answers as to why the Dominican charism is absolutely necessary for the future. And I myself, as I said, I am a very hopeful person about our planet. I still would say, I don't know how it's all going to turn out. And I don't know, one of the things about aging, I know for myself, is that I don't know whether I'm going to get to see things go for the better. Like I always thought that would be something I get to see with my own eyes, like Simeon, I'd like to see this before I die. And I don't know if, I think sometimes I'm like, I might not live to see all the changes that I would really like to be able to see. And I don't always know, like, I don't know, will my school exist into the future? Will our congregations exist? Will the Catholic tradition, as I've understood it, will that continue to go on? But I do know that for these years that are immediately ahead, I think, okay, if I can't be a comet that's going to go forever and ever in orbit, I want to be like a shooting star that's going to be very, very, I'm going to burn especially brightly with the gifts that I particularly have been given at this moment in time, to give beauty and delight and joy for this moment. And that then I'm going to entrust it to hands that are bigger than my own, because I know that that is all that God ultimately asks of me and of all of us. And that God is good, is very, very good. And so that big sense of providence, I think, is maybe the note that I would want to end with. I'm going to pause there. And maybe stop sharing my screen again. And we've got a couple of moments where I'm wondering if maybe we could go back into our small groups, Connie, one last time, and just say, if we had a chance to share with each other, what is one thing that we're going to leave this meeting thinking about? And then we can come back and harness some of the energy from that. But let's go into our small groups for like, why don't we do like 7 more minutes, and then we'll come back and see if there's questions that have emerged from groups or things particularly that we want to do in order to carry forward thoughts into the future.
All right, so enjoy. And they, okay, and they said, did you not get it? You're muted. Okay. Got it. All right. June, do you remember what group you were in?
10.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Angelica, do you remember which group you were in? I think that was 23. They bounced out. Needed to reassign them. All right, they're all in.
That's amazing, Connie.
I will pause the recording for, hold on a minute. It's a really quick message that just like blips at the top that there are 2 minutes remaining, 3 minutes remaining, whatever it is I write. Most people don't even see it, but it's kind of nice to put it. I think that's why they went to the voice message, because people weren't seeing the visual message. So
Do we want to close these now?
closed. They are closed. They're just
I got the
Nobody's
message.
racing back. Yeah, they're having
Yeah.
good conversations.
they're coming back. They're coming back now. We have a few that are still holding on.
Actually, we were waiting to leave the room, but we realized we need to push the button, leave the room.
All right.
That's fantastic. Fantastic.
All right. I
Connie,
still
did
have
everybody-
about 6, 7 people that haven't come back yet,
Okay. Okay.
and someone that got kicked off.
Oh, shoot.
Well, you can leave the meeting and you can leave the room. So I think that's what happens sometimes.
Yes. And I've done that by accident. I was the host and I accidentally left the meeting and then I kicked everybody off.
Actually, I tried to leave a room and there was the only option was to leave meeting. It
Oh.
didn't just let me.
Well,
So
that's because you were the host.
Oh, really? Oh, aren't I a
Yeah.
lucky girl?
That's great. Well, welcome back, everybody. I want to invite, just as a way of making sure that all of the groups, the wisdom from all the groups gets recorded and shared with the facilitator, or is getting ready for this coming summer session, and the facilitator that you'll be working with there. If your team reporter would not mind continuing to put into chat what you consider to be some of the most important highlights of the conversation that you had with each other that you wouldn't want to be lost. And then we do have a couple of moments still, if there's a group that wanted to ask a question again of me or of the whole, to please feel free to raise your hand. And I think we've got a couple of minutes that we could have some general questions too. We're in our contemplative stance.
Someone has a hand up for a question.
Sorry, Catherine, I missed you. I apologize. I was sitting there reading the chat.
I noticed that salvation of souls was in the mission statements at our founding, all of our foundings. We were founded with the purpose of salvation of our own souls and others.
Huh.
But as we took over the writing of our own mission statements, that phrase was removed. But it is part of our founding. It's part of all of our foundings. And it, in fact, may be part of the founding of all religious congregations. It's the canonical language of our founding.
And I think the language of soul over time has changed a lot, hasn't it? Like, what do we actually mean by that? And Donna, you probably know way more about the history of mission statements than I do. Yeah, and might have a lot more to.
Well, I think it's because of the feeling that it's arrogant and the recognition that we're mutually saving one another, especially those missioned in other lands, like mission to China, for example, recognizing that we are as much being saved by them as they are being saved by us. So it was a desire not to be arrogant about truth, not to be arrogant about who's saving who.
And to me, what I hear that balances out the language of salvation of souls, that it definitely is a core Dominican term, but is also the deep Dominican value on the incarnation. Because to me, sometimes salvation of souls sounds kind of disembodied. Like I care about, I don't know, this mystery thing inside of you, but I don't care about your body as a whole. And I think that's where the spirituality, the incarnational spirituality helps hold the soul within a body. And that when I hear that language being dropped for some of the other language that appears right now around solidarity or things like that, it means it's kind of like the care of the whole person, I think is what's getting lifted up, what I hear right now. Yeah. Thanks for throwing that in, Dom. Well, let me pause there and turn things back over to Lorraine and Kathleen. Any wrap-up comments?
Thank you, Ann. This is actually Kathleen, but really you sharing your passion for the Dominican charism certainly enkindled it in all of us. And really you helped us break open the Dominican DNA, not because you had the answers or a definition, but because you led us in questions and brought us together and saw the commonality between us in ways that maybe we hadn't looked at it before. So in many ways, I think this reunites us and ignites us to live out our Dominican charism. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
For the cohort, we will be sending you out a little thoughts on the presentation survey that we're going to ask you to fill out for us. And I think that'll be some other information that'll help us move forward as a cohort. Thank you so much for being here today. We'll have our dates for our future Zooms out within days, and we look forward to this journey together. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.